Michael Madden is a writer for the Boston Globe in the early 80s. He coins the term Boston ball to describe the excellent college basketball coming out of the city in this time period. Boston, when people think about it, typically think about pro basketball with the Celtics winning championships back in the 50s and 60s, and then having another big run in the 1980s. You have Jim Calhoun at Northeastern, Gary Williams at Boston College, and Rick Pitino at Boston University, all leading previously not that strong programs historically to the NCAA tournament during this time period. So the title comes out of that, and the concept for the book comes out of these three great coaches all beginning their coaching career at roughly the same time in Boston. It's not something that any of these coaches had written about a great deal. Calhoun had coached for 14 years at Northeastern. In his memoir, he spent like a chapter and a half writing about it. In Pitino spends like 5 pages on his time at BU, and Gary Williams spends like 4 pages for his 4 years at BC, and I felt like it deserved more coverage. So during the pandemic, I interviewed about 95 people who had played in this time period, had coached in this time period, had played against these guys, and ended up putting this book together, which just came out.
Okay, we're gonna go over some of the chapters in the book and keep moving. We're gonna start with the first chapter. You talk about the pay cut of Calhoun. Talk about that chapter, the pay cut.
Absolutely. Jim Calhoun took a pay cut to become a college basketball coach. I mean, he had been a high school coach in Dedham, Massachusetts, which is just south of Boston. Had taken a program that won 0 games in 1969, and by 1972 they were playing for the state title. And that caught the attention of Northeastern University, which was a school that was in the process of transitioning from Division II to Division I basketball. They were sorely in need of a basketball coach right as the season started. They'd had gone through 2 other coaches that same season. Their first one left to coach the Greek national team in the 1972 Olympics. The second one got offered a job with the FBI and joined the FBI and considered that a more steady job than coaching a fairly low-level Division I college basketball team. Jim Calhoun had been chomping at the bit to jump up and took a $2,000 pay cut to coach college basketball rather than coach high school and be a social studies teacher, which it may not sound like a ton of money, but certainly in that context in the early 70s, when you're making $15,000, $16,000, a $2,000 pay cut is a very significant one. So he took a chance on moving to this program that was transitioning to Division I, and very quickly they were successful. I mean, he took a very modern approach to basketball, very up-tempo game with pressing and trapping, crashing the boards. Northeastern had historically, when they were a Division II school, and been a very successful one, had played a fairly methodical, slow-paced, kind of low-key kind of basketball, and he moved into a much more up-tempo style, which he adopted over the course of his 14 years at Northeastern, and later brought with him to UConn. People who saw UConn's great teams in the 90s and the 2000s, who were familiar with his time at Northeastern, were shocked how similar the players were. They're like Emeka Okafor, people would be like, oh, there was this guy, Mark Halsell, in the early 80s who played exactly like Emeka Okafor. Not quite at the same level because he wasn't in the Big East, but stylistically a very similar player. Ray Allen reminded a lot of people of Reggie Lewis, who had played for Northeastern. Was about like a 6'6", 6'7", very sleek, great shooting, kind of small forward type guy. So much of what people had seen at Northeastern, they saw again at UConn with players who very much resembled what Calhoun had done in his previous job.
Yeah, I was gonna bring it up. Yeah, Reggie Lewis. He played with the Boston Celtics. I was gonna bring it up whether he coached him, and you took the words out of my mouth. Yeah, he did. Coach Reggie Lewis. Definitely. The next chapter, Rick Pitino. You talk about in the second chapter about you come highly recommended. Pitino. Talk about that chapter.
Let's talk about 2 things. About Boston University's history as a fairly weak basketball program, and them looking to go in a new direction and very much embrace sports more in the 1970s, and the young coach they found. Rick Pitino was 25 years old when he got his first Division I job, and he was a guy who'd been an assistant for Boeheim at Syracuse, a very young, ambitious coach, a guy who came out of Howard Garfinkel's 5-star camps, brought that mentality with all the stations, and a really strong sense of competition with him, and convinced the BU athletic director to give him a head coaching job at age 25. He'd been a very good player at the University of Massachusetts, playing alongside the likes of Al Skinner and Dr. J in the early 70s, and he got himself a head coaching job as a very young man. They went from having 6 scholarships to 12 just out of his conversation when he applied for the job at BU. It must be the greatest job interview ever. He doubled the recruiting budget. They doubled the number of scholarships. Pitino was obviously a very young, ambitious, and talented guy who was going somewhere, and they invested in it and it proved very successful. In 1983, his fifth year on the job, they get to the NCAA tournament. BU had not been to the tournament since the 1950s, so it was a tremendous leap forward for Boston University.
Okay, the next chapter obviously you talk about is Gary Williams. Talk about that chapter once again. Not that much is expected of the Eagles. Talk about Gary Williams.
Well, Gary Williams is a guy who came from New Jersey originally. He played at the University of Maryland. He was mentored very closely by a guy named Dr. Tom Davis, who was a great coach at Iowa, coached A.C. Earl, who I see you had on the show in the late 80s and late 80s and early 90s.
Oh, you saw
Tom Davis, first coach at Lafayette, then he went to Boston College and had a very successful run there. Gary Williams was an assistant at BC, and they ran a very up-tempo kind of offense. This is one of the themes of the book, that in the 1970s, a lot of college basketball got dominated by big men. At first, down west, you had at UCLA, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Bill Walton. You saw Bob Lanier, Artis Gilmore, a little bit later, Patrick Ewing. You wanted to be at the top of college basketball in the 70s into the early 80s. You needed like a 7-footer to be a dominant force in the middle. These schools were not recruiting those kind of guys. These schools weren't at that level in terms of recruiting, so they ended up going for a lot of smaller, quicker guys, and that became very much BC style when they got into the early years of the Big East. A lot of very quick players. They stole the ball, they pressed, they trapped, they ran a fast break. This is true under Tom Davis and as well as Gary Williams. When Tom Davis leaves, Williams, who had gone on to coach at American University and bring them to their first NIT, back when the NIT was a much bigger deal, ended up getting the BC job and continued in that style. BC did a great job finding guys who were not heavily recruited but went on to excellent pro careers in their time period. Particularly under that Williams-Davis era, they recruited a lot of great players from the state of Connecticut. Michael Adams, who went on to be an NBA All-Star, played for Washington, played for the Nuggets, played a bunch of other places, is a guy BC recruited out of Hartford, Connecticut. He'd been a Golden Gloves boxer, but was not a heavily recruited basketball player. Kevin Mackey, who was a guy who was an assistant at BC, saw him in a tournament and said, "We got to get this guy to campus." So they brought him in, and he was a starting point guard for 4 years. John Bagley, who had a very long, successful NBA career in the 80s and 90s, is another guy out of the state of Connecticut from Bridgeport, Connecticut, who ended up at BC. Not heavily recruited, but he went on to be the Big East Player of the Year in 1981. So BC kept finding just a bunch of these guys who were quick, explosive players who could really play this 40-minute up and down the court, up-tempo style of basketball.
Yeah, you said that that AC Earl was on my show, so you checked out that episode. You was able to come through that on Facebook or about
I saw it on YouTube. I just quickly, I hadn't heard your show before, so I went looking around. I saw that you had AC Earl on it. Oh, that's exciting. He played for Tom Davis. So, yeah, I haven't listened to it yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it was a couple years ago. Yeah, it's true. That's the thing that's amazing with so far this interview. You talk about players that Calhoun and Williams coached. They was in the NBA. Did Rick Pitino coach any NBA players that went out to go to the NBA from Boston University?
One guy he coached at BU who went on to the NBA, a guy named Gary Plummer, who played for the Pistons in the mid-'80s, didn't have a very strong career. One thing is, considering all the success Pitino's had, it's kind of surprising how few of his guys have gone on to like super-duper NBA careers. I mean, like, maybe like Jamal Mashburn might be the best guy he coached in terms of going to the NBA. Yeah. He had a great career, but it's not like he's one of like the 50 all-time great players. Yeah. Williams, I would say Williams and especially Calhoun have a much more successful track record at putting guys in the NBA, and I'm not really sure why that is. I think some people would say Pitino's very much like a system kind of coach, that they're just very much running his very aggressive style of basketball, whatever it is, that he finds guys who play well in that system but may not in and of themselves be genuinely elite talents. I really don't know, but it's kind of funny that he has tended to, considering his success, had fewer guys who have these really elite pro careers.
Okay, the next chapter you talk about getting over the hump, getting over a hump. About Jim Calhoun. Talk about that chapter.
It's about Northeastern basketball in the 70s that it's primarily about recruiting, that they went from being a Division II program that primarily recruited guys from in and around Boston to getting players from wherever they could around the country. And they developed very strong recruiting pipelines into both Pittsburgh and Baltimore, that many of their top players guys like Pete Harris, guys like Mark Pulse will come out of Pittsburgh in the '70s, and they go into Baltimore very strong in the early '80s, and that's where they get Reggie Lewis, who played for that famous Dunbar High team that had David Wingate and Muggsy Bogues and like 5 NBA guys on it. Reggie Lewis was actually not even a starting player in high school. He was David Wingate's backup, but he gets to Northeastern and he's like automatically the best player in that conference he's in. He's the conference player of the year 3 times up in the North Atlantic Conference.
Okay, chapter 5, you talk about great kids. With Pitino, talk about that chapter.
That's about Pitino's early teams at BU that really put his system in play. BU played a very plodding style of basketball, and all of a sudden they're fast breaking for 40 minutes. The teams that had played them the year before and blown them out, all of a sudden it was actually playing against them. They all you guys. And it was really convincing the new system of play they had in place. These guys are running 5 miles a day. They're instant on the football field. They're playing full court basketball for hours on end. There was a rule put in place in college basketball called the Pitino rule, just about how much practice time you could have. You only have 20 hours a week. Pitino had these guys 40 to 50 hours of basketball a week during the season. It like individual instruction early in the morning, and conditions, that when the classroom on, we just had dominated every hour of these kids' lives in the early '80s.
Yeah, the audio was still going in and out again. It was, I don't know what's going on your end. The audio is coming in and out again.
You hear me better now?
Yes.
There's a button I need to press when I talk, the way this is working. So,
Okay.
I was talking about Pitino and his Pitino, the excellent conditioning his teams had, how they were able to fast break and push their opponents around to a great extent in the way they had in the previous years at Boston University.
Okay, chapter 6, pack the bags. We're off to Albuquerque. Gary Williams, talk about that chapter.
These Boston College's tournament success in the early '80s. They pulled a couple of upsets in the 1983 tournament, and they nearly got to the Elite Eight. They played Ralph Sampson's Virginia team and nearly knocked them off.
Okay, chapter 7, Northwestern, Calhoun.
That chapter title and figured, oh, that's a misprint. No, the reason I did that is because everybody in the national press called them Northwestern when they were Northeastern. They knew about Northwestern from the Big Ten, so they kept calling them that, even though they weren't. At the same time, Northeastern was going out and was like the first of the great mid-major programs, and nobody wanted to play in the NCAA tournament. 3 straight years in the early '80s, they pulled upsets and knocked opponents off in the NCAA tournament. The Villanova team that went on and won the national title, they nearly knocked them out in the second round. So they were the team nobody wanted to play in March in the early '80s.
Okay, chapter 8, talk about like the Pacific Ocean. Rick Pitino, talk about that chapter.
A couple of the teams in the early '80s at BU, they were trying to find their identity and build their program back up. Very much about their fast-breaking, aggressive style of play, and also the relationship the guys develop over time. This is very much a book about the young men on these teams and the strong bonds they build over time.
Chapter 9, they probably achieved as much as they could. Gary Williams.
That's like the 1984-85 BC team, which reached the Sweet 16. Kind of surprisingly, they barely made the NCAA tournament. Then they upset Texas Tech, and then in the second round they beat a Duke team that this is really the first great success year, a Duke team with Mark Allery and Jay Billis and Tommy Amaker and Gerald Henderson, a great team. Lots of guys who go on and run that Final Four team the next year for them. BC knocks them off in the second round, gets to the Sweet 16, and nearly beat the Memphis team that got to the Final Four. That BC team in '84-'85 actually played all 4 of the Final Four teams, which were St. John's, Memphis, Georgetown, and Villanova. BC actually beat Villanova and St. John's during the season, lost by 1 to Georgetown, lost by 2 to Memphis. So they really hung with all the heavyweights of college basketball last season.
Chapter 10, you talk about our best recruiting year ever. Jim Calhoun, talk about that chapter.
That's about the recruiting class at Northeastern that includes Reggie Lewis, Andre LaFleur, Wes Fuller. They're there 4 years. They win 4 conference titles, go to the tournament each year. And Reggie Lewis, of course, goes on to an excellent NBA career with the Boston Celtics.
Okay, next chapter, talk about truly a team of character, Rick Pitino.
That's two overseas Boston University teams. Their team captain, a guy named Arturo Brown, had a heart attack during a pickup game in September and died. A player who everybody thought would be a first-round pick in the NBA draft the upcoming season. In spite of losing their great star, they go on and they fight their way to the NCAA tournament and earn BYU's first bid in more than a quarter century.
Chapter 12, I was happy at BC, Gary Williams.
Ending up finding a new job. He's got serious complaints about the BC job. It's just their support is fairly limited, just like their alumni and their students. They have a not very good building. They play called the Roberts Center, which looks more like a bowling alley than a basketball arena. And he gets an offer from Ohio State, and he ends up heading to Ohio State, which is his first jump beyond Boston College into the Big Ten there.
Next chapter, you talk about where did you get that guy, Jim Calhoun.
Calhoun's jump to Connecticut and how he gets a jump into the Big East and very quickly rebuilds at UConn. They win the NIT in 1988 and go on to go to all those Final Fours and win all those championships. It's in many ways how the model he adopted at Northeastern stylistically and slowly building through recruiting, he does once again at UConn. He's only coached two places, he's in both places a very long time, and it's about his very successful run at UConn, where I would argue he's the second greatest college coach of all time. I mean, you've got John Wooden wins all those championships, of course, at UCLA. If you look at all the other contenders for the all-time great coach, those guys are programs that are already well-established places. If you're Dean Smith at UNC's been awesome forever. Krzyzewski at Duke was in the Final Four 2 years before he got there. Indiana, Bobby Knight, Indiana been a great program forever. Kentucky's been a great program forever. UConn was pretty good in the East, but not a school you'd expect to win a bunch of national titles. And he got something going and really out of nowhere made them into one of the country's, top 5 or 10 college programs. So I'd argue Calhoun, as a result of that, if you're ranking the all-time coaches, I'd probably put him number 2, and just as a program builder in the same way that Wooden was at UCLA.
Okay, chapter 14, Rick Pitino, Proper Perspective. Talk about that chapter.
That goes into Pitino's move away from he to become an assistant with C.B. Brown with the Knicks. Pitino's a guy who gets very anxious and jumps around a lot. He then goes to Providence, leads them to the Final Four, and every other coaching stop since then with the Knicks and Kentucky and Louisville, his down tenure with the Celtics. It's just basically a summary of the remainder of Pitino's career and how it in many ways follows some of the same patterns that he had at Boston University.
And the last chapter, you talk about homecoming, Gary Williams.
Returned to Maryland, where he built them into one of the great programs in the country. One of the most remarkable things about Gary Williams is the way he built his program at Maryland. So, he didn't go chase the AAU guys. He's like, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. There's tons of great players around here. If you look at that 2001, 2002 title team with Juan Dixon and Blake and all those guys, they're all guys from right around Maryland. They're guys from Maryland and Virginia and Washington, D.C. He built this genuinely local team and won a national title with it, which is very much against everything happening in college basketball with the summer AAU elite leagues and the sneakers company camp. He just went around to the local gyms and found great players and built a national championship team.
And finally, the epilogue, March 31st, 1988. Talk about that epilogue.
The 1988 NIT because all the guys in the book are there in one form or another. The finals of the 1988 NIT are Jim Calhoun at UConn beating Gary Williams at Ohio State, playing at Madison Square Garden on the floor where Rick Pitino is coaching the Knicks that very year. So in a funny way, they kind of have all come together by the late 80s as they've gone on to do bigger and better jobs.
Okay, when you prepared to do this book, did you reach out to Jim Calhoun, Rick Pitino, and Gary Williams, or you did it without their participation? Put this book together.
Anybody I could think of. I never heard from Rick Pitino. Several of his former players got in contact with him for me and encouraged him to talk to me, but it didn't happen. I had a great conversation with Jim Calhoun. We talked for 2 hours. I had a great conversation with Gary Williams. I talked to many of their former players. I think I did 95 interviews for the book. Spoke with Mike Jarvis, Jim O'Brien, Michael Adams, a lot of great players, Andre LaFleur, a lot of great players from this era. And hopefully I've tried to tell a very full picture of this time. I would have loved to talk to Pitino, but for whatever reason, didn't have time or didn't want to.
All right. Where can people find this book?
Noble, Amazon, any of your online booksellers are going to have it. If you get in touch with me on social media, I'll happily send you a signed book plate as thanks for buying the book.
All right. Thanks for coming on the show. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you. That's Clayton Trutor. Has a new book out called Boston Ball, about the forgotten cradle of coaches, Jim Calhoun, Gary Williams, and Rick Pitino, about how they pay their dues and how they will become household names later on in their coaching profession. So that's was an interesting interview.